Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6. The past couple weeks, we've been discussing various issues related to terrorism. Last week, we examined the threat brought by the far right. So this week, we're going to examine the threat posed by environmental and animal rights organizations. So as with the far right, it's important to be clear about what groups and individuals we're discussing. Okay, these groups and individuals are not your regular animal rights or environmental activists. It's not the Humane Society, right? It's not any of these mainstream environmental and animal rights organizations. Okay, we're discussing these groups and individuals that take this activism to the next level and commit violent acts in defense of their ideology. So the environmental animal rights extremist movement started in the 1970s, but really began to take shape in the 1980s, or in 1980, with the founding of Earth First. Now, Earth First welcomed a variety of ideologies into their group. You had environmentalists, you had some anarchists, you had pagans, you had this wide variety of people that kind of fell into this fold of Earth First. So, unsurprisingly, right, this kind of conglomeration of all these various ideologies really didn't play well. Okay? It didn't really work that well. And Earth First ended up splitting apart around 1990, 1992, somewhere in there. You had those that wanted to be more of a political type of group, and then you had others that wanted more of a direct action, like let's go do things. So in 1992, the Earth Liberation Front was founded by former members of Earth First, who were dissatisfied with the lack of activism in the former group. I posted an article by Stoner and Pearlstein that kind of outlines the history of the movement. It's really good background information. It's not an assigned reading, but it really does provide good background into kind of the ideology and who these particular groups are. So this week there's 4 assigned readings. You have Juice, who focuses on leaderless resistance. Carson et al., that examines attacks from 1970 to 2007. Cermak et al., who presents a report looking at bombings and arsons from 95 to 2010. And then Hirschhoffler and Mudd, who explore attacks not attacks, but whether attacks by environmental animal rights groups should be considered terrorism. All right, so let's start with Juice. Leaderless resistance is actually a term coined by a white supremacist, Louis Beam. In the annals of white supremacy, or the white supremacist movement in America, Louis Beam is a big deal. He's a big-time player, or was. So back in the 80s, he was dissatisfied with the current state of far-right groups, how they were organized. And he proposed that this normal kind of bureaucratic structure that everybody had, which was very common, had these levels and you had this identifiable leader. That wasn't the best way to do this, according to him. He thought that those groups were too easily infiltrated by law enforcement. They're too easy for law enforcement to surveil. So he proposed that they should use this leaderless resistance, which is essentially more of a cellular structure where you have these independently operating cells without any kind of discernible central leadership, no central authority, no centralized direction, where everybody kind of does what they want to do as far as incidents or activities, however they feel like they should be doing or manifesting their activism, that's what they should be doing. So in its purest form, all individuals and all groups operate independently. And I really don't have a group per se, like you have these cells. Okay, so all individuals and all these cells would operate independently of each other. They don't ever report to any kind of central authority. There's no command structure. Even these cells don't really communicate. Okay, so everybody's just kind of every man for themselves kind of thing. This type of structure makes it very difficult for law enforcement to counter these types of groups because there isn't any kind of group really to target. And ELF has incorporated this structure, and they're very clear about it on their website and propaganda that they put out. They're very, very clear that they're a leaderless type of organization. Now, they do have spokespeople, but these spokespeople don't really hold any type of leadership type position, and they don't give orders telling people you will go do these things. Now, they may publish communiques, they may issue calls for action, but they don't really do anything as far as leadership-wise within the group. So there isn't really any membership in ELF. Like, you don't pay a membership fee like you do for a lot of other types of groups. You just decide to become an activist. So basically all what happens is that these calls for action go out, and then people decide whether or not they want to form their own cells, whether or not they want to commit in this direct action. One of the benefits of that is because there's really no clear-cut guidelines for membership. ELF can attract a wide variety of individuals. They really don't limit themselves to any one particular type of person. And they talk about that a little bit in Juice. They also so by not or by attracting a wide variety of individuals, they're not limited by ideology, and people can move to do things based on different ideologies. So like Earth First, having anarchists and having pagans and having all these different ideologies was a problem because they were an actual group. It's not a problem for ELF. Okay, it's not a problem to have these varying types of ideologies within kind of this overarching theme of environmental activism. Okay, so people can feel to act out however they want to act out, which also helps them attract young males who, from your background in criminal justice, that young males are more prone to violent action than any other group in society. So while you have this kind of broad ideology of protecting the environment or protecting animals, how each person decides to do that, or each cell decides to do that, is completely up to them, and then they all kind of use this ELF moniker for themselves. All right, so that's Juice. All right, so if you remember back a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how there's debate about what is terrorism, right? What is terrorism? What is not terrorism? So there's the same debate going on when you discuss these environmental and animal rights incidents, groups, activists. Are these actions that are committed by ELF and ALF actually terrorism? Or are they crimes? Or are they ecotage? Or are they some other type of incident under some other kind of name? Okay, so Carson et al. Begins to explore this a little bit, but Hirschhoffler and Mudd do a lot more of it in more detail. So we'll talk about Carson now. So they use the Global Terrorism Database, and they looked at attacks committed by environmental animal rights from 1970 to 2007. And they found, kind of going back to the same theme of what is terrorism, the GTD has their own definition of what terrorism is and what they use to classify terrorism within their database. So based on their definition, they found that 17% of the incidents that they had actually fit their definition of terrorism. So then they compare those to those that did not fit their definition. In addition to the data and information about the actual incidents, they also interviewed 25 people who had participated in some form of environmental animal activism. So they found incidents increased in the 80s and 90s, and then began to decline in the 2000s. So one of the main tenets kind of fueling this argument about, or debate about whether or not an incident is terrorism, is that ELF and ALF rarely attack people. And Carson and them and her co-authors found that only one incident actually resulted in the death of a person. Most of their attacks were on things, equipment, facilities, etc. But they did find examples of assassinations, armed assaults, bombings, explosions, facility attacks, and unarmed assaults committed by environmental animal rights activists. As part of their terrorism definition, the GTD included attacks on buildings that caused permanent damage as a terrorist act. So then they broke these various incidents down by the type of targets. There's a lot of information in this article. They have a lot of different tables. They looked at a lot of different things, and we don't have time to go into all of those here. So take some time and examine, all the tables included in the article. One thing they did find that's particularly of interest is that, even though, and I'm doing it here kind of in this video, but animal rights and environmental movements are often spoken about almost interchangeably, but they did find differences in attack patterns between the two ideologies. So then at the end of this, they present what they found from their interviews, and there are some interesting insights into the movements in their presentation with the interviews. So spend some time going through what they present, what they found in their interviews. All right, moving on to Cermak. All right, so Cermak and his co-authors, they examined only bombings and arson attacks committed by environmental animal rights activists from 1995 to 2010. So they focused only on bombings and arsons. Now, if you looked at the methodology of how they determined which incidents to include, and you look at what the GTD did, you'll find a little bit of a different methodology used to identify incidents. So take a minute and kind of look at the two different types of methodology. Think about the differences in those and how that might influence identification of incidents for each study. So they found 239 arsons and bombings committed from 1995 to 2010. 55% of them attributed to ELF, 45% attributed to ALF. 62% were bombings, 38% were arsons. But something they did different than Carson is they really looked at the perpetrators who committed these crimes. And they found that most were single white males with some college education. And over half of the people that perpetrated these incidents had affiliation with both ELF and ALF. And they found that a lot of them committed multiple acts. So you have a relatively small number of people committing a larger number of acts. They were also able to examine how much participation perpetrators had within the movements, how many charges they had against them, how they were recruited. Okay, so this article really gives some insights into who the people are that are perpetrating these attacks. All right, finally, Hirschhoffler and Mudd. Now, this article, they go into great detail of this debate about whether or not these types of incidents should be considered terrorism. So spend some time reading through these various perspectives on why it should or should not be considered terrorism. Now, at the end, they conclude that the majority of the incidents perpetrated by these groups and these activists should not be considered terrorism. All right, so just because I gave you, I guess spoiler alert, right? Read the whole thing. Read the whole article and think about, their process they went through to determine whether or not these should be considered terrorism or not terrorism. Because there is a lot of debate, out there about how these things should be classified. So what do you think about their argument and their conclusion? Okay, and then based on that, what are the policy ramifications for either concluding that they are or not terrorism? Because that's a big deal, right? It's a big deal whether or not these things are considered terrorism or whether they're considered just crimes or if they're considered something different. Okay, so really read that article and really think about how they're breaking things down and how they're looking at the various debates about whether or not these are or are not terrorist acts. All right, with that, I'm going to end. Be sure you complete your assignments for the week. And as always, if you have questions, please do let me know. I'll see you next week.